The dust hung in the air like a shroud over Amarillo, Texas, and Beatrice Nolan wondered if she would ever feel clean again, if the weight of her father's debts would ever lift from her shoulders, or if this worn calico dress with its frayed hem and patched elbows would be the only thing she owned until the day she died. It was 1883, and the summer heat pressed down on the small boarding house where she worked from before dawn until long after dark, scrubbing floors, washing linens, serving meals to dusty cowboys and cattle traders who barely looked at her except to bark orders or complain about the temperature of their coffee. The dress had once been blue, a cornflower shade that her mother had sewn with careful hands 3 years before the fever took her. But now it was the color of dishwater, thin enough in places that Beatrice had to layer it over her one remaining shift to maintain any modesty at all. She pulled the wet sheets from the wash basin behind the boarding house, her hands red and cracked from the lye soap, and hung them on the line that stretched between 2 scraggly cottonwood trees. The wind whipped at her skirts, and she felt the familiar give of the fabric where the seam had torn again at her waist. Tonight she would have to mend it by candlelight, squinting in the dim room she shared with 2 other girls who worked at the millinery shop down the street. They had offered to lend her a dress more times than she could count, but Beatrice's pride, thin and battered as it was, would not allow her to accept. Her father had gambled away everything they owned before he drank himself to death 2 winters ago, leaving her with nothing but his debts and a reputation that followed her like a shadow. She would not add charity case to the list of things people whispered about when she walked by. The boarding house belonged to Mrs. Hartwell, a widow with a sharp tongue and sharper eyes who paid Beatrice in room and board plus $2 a week. It was barely enough to keep body and soul together, let alone save anything for fabric or thread, or the 100 other things a young woman of 20 needed. Beatrice had tried to find other work, but Amarillo was a cattle town, and the respectable positions went to girls whose fathers had not died owing money to half the businessmen in the Panhandle. So she scrubbed and cleaned and served, wearing the same dress day after day, washing it on Sunday evenings and praying it would dry before Monday morning. She did not notice the man watching her from the corner of the building, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his lean frame propped against the weathered wood. He had been staying at the boarding house for 3 weeks now, always polite, always quiet, paying his rent on time and keeping to himself in a way that made Mrs. Hartwell approve and the other boarders curious. His name was Wyatt Morgan, and he was a ranch hand at the Triple Creek, spread 15 miles outside of town, though he had been coming into Amarillo every few days for reasons he did not explain. He was 26, with the kind of sun-weathered face that came from years of working cattle under the brutal Texas sky, and hands that were calloused and strong but surprisingly gentle when he tipped his hat to the ladies or held a door open. Wyatt had noticed Beatrice the first day he arrived, not because she was beautiful, though there was something in the delicate bones of her face and the determined set of her mouth that caught his attention, but because of the dress. He had seen poverty before, had lived it himself growing up on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri. But there was something about the way she held her head high despite the threadbare fabric, the way she moved with quiet dignity even as she hauled buckets of water and armloads of dirty linens, that made his chest tighten with an emotion he could not quite name. He pushed off from the wall and walked away before she could see him, his boots leaving prints in the dust of the alley. That evening, he rode out to the Triple Creek Ranch and asked the foreman if he could take on extra work. The foreman, a grizzled man named Pete who had been ranching since before Wyatt was born, raised an eyebrow but did not ask questions. Cowboys who wanted extra work usually had their reasons, and as long as they showed up sober and did the job, Pete did not pry. For the next week, Wyatt worked double shifts, riding the fence lines in the morning and helping with the branding in the afternoon, coming back to the ranch house after dark with his muscles aching and his hands blistered. He saved every extra penny, counting it out in the lamplight of the bunkhouse, while the other men played cards and told stories. When he had enough, he rode into Amarillo on a Saturday morning and walked into the dry goods store run by a German immigrant named Mr. Schneider. The store smelled of leather and wool, and the faint sweet scent of the peppermint sticks Mr. Schneider kept in a jar by the register. Wyatt walked past the bolts of fabric, the spools of ribbon, the ready-made shirts and trousers, until he found what he was looking for. There were 3 dresses hanging on a rack near the back. Simple calico prints in sturdy fabric that would hold up to hard work, but still had a touch of femininity to them. One was a soft green with tiny white flowers. Another was a warm brown with a pattern of autumn leaves. And the third was a deep rose color that reminded him of the wild flowers that grew near the creek on the ranch. He lifted them down carefully, checking the sizes against his memory of Beatrice's slender frame. Mr. Schneider came over, his round face curious but professional. "These for your sister?" the shopkeeper asked in his thick accent. Wyatt shook his head. "Just a friend who could use them." Mr. Schneider named a price that made Wyatt wince, but he counted out the money without complaint, watching as the older man wrapped the dresses in brown paper and tied them with string. Wyatt tucked the package under his arm and walked out into the bright morning sun, his heart beating faster than it had any right to. He was not sure what he was doing or why it mattered so much, only that he could not stand to see Beatrice in that torn dress one more day. The problem was how to give them to her without making it awkward or embarrassing. He knew she was proud, could see it in every line of her body, and he did not want to wound that pride or make her feel like an object of pity. So he waited and watched, learning her routine over the next few days. She rose before dawn to start the fires in the kitchen stove, worked through the morning serving breakfast and cleaning the guest rooms, took a brief rest in the afternoon, and then served dinner before washing dishes until late into the evening. The only time she was away from the boarding house for any length of time was on Sunday mornings when she walked to the small church at the edge of town. On the following Sunday, Wyatt made his move. He waited until he heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard the front door close behind her, and then he slipped into the boarding house through the back entrance that led to the kitchen. Mrs. Hartwell was in her private parlor with the door closed, going over her account books as she did every Sunday morning. The other boarders were either still asleep or out on their own errands. Wyatt moved quickly and quietly, climbing the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor where the staff rooms were located. He knew which room was Beatrice's because he had seen her come out of it one morning when he was heading down for breakfast. It was the smallest room at the end of the hall, barely larger than a closet, with a slanted ceiling that followed the roofline. He knocked softly, waiting to make sure no one answered, and then eased the door open. The room was painfully sparse. A narrow bed with a thin quilt, a small table with a chipped wash basin, a single wooden chair by the window, and a few pegs on the wall where Beatrice had hung her shawl and bonnet. There was no mirror, no rug, no personal items except for a small wooden box on the table that probably held whatever meager possessions she had managed to keep. Wyatt felt his throat tighten as he looked around, thinking of all the things a young woman should have and did not. He laid the package on the chair by the window, positioning it carefully so it would be the first thing she saw when she walked in. Then he turned and left, closing the door behind him and making his way back downstairs, and out of the building before anyone could see him. His hands were shaking slightly, and he could not say whether it was from nerves or something else entirely. Beatrice returned from church an hour later, her bonnet in her hand and her face flushed from the walk in the heat. She climbed the stairs slowly, already mentally preparing herself for the afternoon's work, and pushed open the door to her room without really looking. It was not until she had closed the door behind her and turned toward the window that she saw the package on the chair. She froze, her heart suddenly racing. No one ever came into her room, no one ever left her anything. For a wild moment she thought perhaps Mrs. Hartwell had finally decided to give her some cast-off clothing, but the landlady would have simply told her, not left a mysterious package. Beatrice crossed the small space in 2 steps and picked up the parcel, feeling the weight of it, the crisp brown paper tied with string. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the string loose and folded back the paper. The dresses spilled out in a cascade of color and soft fabric, and Beatrice gasped, actually gasped out loud in the empty room. She lifted the green one first, holding it up to the light, seeing how the tiny flowers caught the sun, how the fabric was thick and well made, how it would fit her perfectly if the size was right. Then the brown one, with its pattern of leaves that reminded her of autumn days when life had been simpler. And finally, the rose-colored one, which was so pretty it made her throat ache. She sank down onto the edge of her bed, the dresses pooled in her lap, and felt tears prick her eyes. Who would do this? Who would spend money on dresses for her, and why? Her mind raced through the possibilities. It could not be Mrs. Hartwell, who counted every penny and would never spend money on an employee. It could not be the other girls, who were kind but barely made enough to support themselves. It could not be any of the regular boarders, most of whom barely acknowledged her existence. And yet someone had done this. Someone had noticed her worn dress, her patched sleeves, her frayed hem. Someone had cared enough to spend money they probably could not spare to give her something beautiful and new. The thought was overwhelming, and Beatrice found herself crying in earnest, hot tears sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto the rose-colored fabric in her lap. She cried for her mother, who had died too young. She cried for her father, who had loved her in his way but had left her with nothing but shame and debt. She cried for herself, for the girl she had been before life had worn her down to the bone. And then she dried her eyes, folded the dresses carefully, and hid them in the wooden box under her few other possessions. She could not wear them yet, not until she knew who had given them to her and why. It would not be right. But all through the afternoon as she worked, she felt lighter, as if the weight on her shoulders had lessened just a fraction. Someone had seen her. Someone had cared. And that knowledge, fragile as it was, felt like the first real gift she had received in years. Wyatt watched her at dinner that evening, trying not to be obvious about it. She moved through the dining room as she always did, serving plates and refilling coffee cups, but there was something different in the way she held herself. A softness around her mouth, a brightness in her eyes that had not been there before. He wondered if she had found the dresses, if she liked them, if she had any idea who had left them. Over the next few days, Beatrice tried to figure out who her mysterious benefactor was. She paid closer attention to the boarders, looking for any sign of unusual interest or kindness, but found nothing. Mr. Patterson was a salesman who spent most of his time writing letters in his room. Mr. Chen was a railroad worker who spoke little English and kept to himself. There were 2 brothers named Sullivan who worked at the stockyards and were always covered in the smell of cattle and manure. And then there was Wyatt Morgan, the quiet cowboy who always said please and thank you, but never made conversation beyond that. She studied him more carefully than the others, not because she suspected him, but because he puzzled her. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck and gray eyes that seemed to see more than he let on. He was always polite, always respectful, and there was a gentleness in the way he moved that seemed at odds with the calluses on his hands and the gun belt he sometimes wore. But he had never given her any indication that he even noticed her beyond her role as a servant, so she dismissed the thought and continued her search elsewhere. After a week, she could stand it no longer. She put on the green dress with the white flowers, feeling the soft fabric against her skin like a caress, and came downstairs for breakfast. The effect was immediate and gratifying. Mrs. Hartwell looked up from the stove and blinked in surprise. Mr. Patterson paused with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Even the Sullivan brothers stopped their constant bickering long enough to stare. "Well, Miss Nolan," Mrs. Hartwell said, her sharp face softening just a little. "Do not you look fine this morning?" Beatrice felt her cheeks heat, but she smiled and continued setting out the plates. She did not look at Wyatt, did not see the way his hands tightened around his fork, or the way his eyes followed her movements as she moved around the room. He had not expected her to wear the dresses so soon, and seeing her in the green calico, seeing how it brought out the color of her eyes and the rose in her cheeks, made him feel things he had no right to feel for a woman he barely knew. After breakfast, as Beatrice was clearing the tables, Mrs. Hartwell pulled her aside. "That is a mighty nice dress," the older woman said, her eyes shrewd. "How did you come by it?" Beatrice had prepared for this question. "Someone left it in my room while I was at church last Sunday," she said honestly. "I do not know who, but I am grateful for it." Mrs. Hartwell's eyebrows rose. "Someone left you a dress, just left it there without saying anything." "3 dresses, actually," Beatrice said, meeting the landlady's gaze steadily. "And no, there was no note or anything to indicate who they were from." Mrs. Hartwell looked like she wanted to pursue the matter, but something in Beatrice's face stopped her. "Well," she said after a moment, "I suppose that is your business. But you be careful, girl. Men do not give gifts without expecting something in return." The words stung because Beatrice had thought the same thing herself, had lain awake at night worrying that whoever had given her the dresses would come forward expecting gratitude of a kind she was not willing to give. But as the days passed and no one claimed responsibility, she began to relax. Perhaps it truly had been a gift with no strings attached. Perhaps someone had simply wanted to do something kind. Wyatt continued to watch her from a distance, feeling a warmth in his chest every time he saw her in one of the dresses he had bought. She wore the green one on Monday, the brown one on Wednesday, and the rose-colored one on Friday, rotating them carefully and taking obvious care to keep them clean and pressed. He noticed that she had mended the torn dress as well, folding it away in her room, and he was glad. She deserved to have more than one outfit, deserved to feel pretty and cared for. But he did not speak to her beyond the usual pleasantries, did not give any indication that he was the one who had left the dresses. He told himself it was because he did not want to make her uncomfortable, did not want her to feel obligated to him, but the truth was more complicated. He was afraid that if he told her, she would reject the gift and him along with it. Afraid that she would see him as just another cowboy looking for a pretty face to chase. Afraid that the tentative connection he felt, this one-sided knowledge of her and her life, would shatter if he tried to make it real. The summer deepened into July, and Amarillo sweltered under the relentless sun. Beatrice continued her work, feeling more human now that she had decent clothing to wear, and Wyatt continued to stay at the boarding house even though the other ranch hands thought he was crazy for spending money on rent, when he could sleep in the bunkhouse for free. He told them he liked the privacy, like being able to come and go as he pleased. But the truth was that he had become addicted to the sight of Beatrice moving through the dining room, the sound of her quiet voice as she spoke to the other boarders, the rare smile that lit her face when something pleased her. It was not healthy, this obsession, and he knew it. He should ride back to the ranch and forget about the girl with the sad eyes and the threadbare dress. But every time he decided to leave, every time he told himself it was time to move on, he would see her struggling with a heavy bucket of water or hear Mrs. Hartwell snap at her for some minor infraction, and he would find himself rooted to the spot, unable to walk away. One evening in late July, everything changed. Beatrice was carrying a tray of dirty dishes from the dining room to the kitchen when she heard raised voices from the front parlor. Mrs. Hartwell was arguing with someone, her normally controlled voice sharp with anger. Beatrice set the tray down and moved closer, not quite eavesdropping but unable to help overhearing. "I do not care if he owed you money," Mrs. Hartwell was saying. "The girl is not responsible for her father's debts. She was barely 17 when he died, for heaven's sake." "The law says different," a male voice replied, cold and hard. "Benjamin Nolan owed me $200 and I intend to collect. If his daughter cannot pay, she can work it off." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that voice. It belonged to Samuel Reeves, a man who owned several businesses in Amarillo, including a saloon that had a reputation for employing women who did more than just serve drinks. Her father had lost money to Reeves in a poker game 3 years ago, and Beatrice had thought the debt had died with him. Apparently, she had been wrong. She pushed open the door to the parlor before she could think better of it. Mrs. Hartwell stood by the fireplace, her face flushed with anger, while Samuel Reeves lounged in one of the good chairs, his expensive suit and slicked-back hair making him look like a snake in human form. He was in his 40s, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth, and Beatrice had always gone out of her way to avoid him when she saw him on the street. "Mr. Reeves," she said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will, "I was not aware that my father still owed you money." Reeves smiled, showing too many teeth. "Miss Nolan, how lovely to see you. And yes, your dear departed father did indeed owe me a considerable sum. I have the promissory note right here." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and held it up. $200 plus interest. That comes to about $300 now. $300. It might as well have been 3,000. Beatrice felt the room tilt slightly, felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "I do not have that kind of money," she said quietly. "I did not think you did," Reeves said, his smile widening. "But I am a reasonable man. I am willing to offer you employment at my establishment. You would earn enough to pay off the debt in, a year or two, maybe less if you are particularly popular with the customers." The implication was clear, and Beatrice felt bile rise in her throat. "I will not do that," Reeves shrugged. "Then I will take you to court. The judge will side with me, you can be sure of that, and when you cannot pay, you will go to debtor's prison until you can. Is that really what you want?" Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward, her face furious. "You leave this house right now, Samuel Reeves, before I call the sheriff." "The sheriff is a friend of mine," Reeves said mildly, "and he knows the law as well as I do. Miss Nolan owes me money and I intend to collect." He stood up, straightening his jacket. "You have 1 week to think about my offer, Miss Nolan. After that I will file with the court. Good evening, ladies." He walked out, leaving a poisonous silence in his wake. Beatrice stood frozen, her mind racing. $300. Where would she ever get $300? She made $2 a week, which meant it would take her almost 3 years to save that much, and that was assuming she never spent a penny on anything else. And Reeves would not wait 3 years. He would drag her to court, would take away her freedom, would force her into a situation she would rather die than accept. Mrs. Hartwell put a hand on her shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Do not you worry, child. We will figure something out." But Beatrice could see the worry in the older woman's eyes and knew that Mrs. Hartwell had no more solutions than she did. She excused herself and went upstairs to her room, closing the door and sinking down onto her bed. The 3 dresses hung on their pegs, pretty and useless, a reminder that someone had cared enough to give her a gift, but not enough to save her from this. Wyatt had heard the entire conversation from where he stood in the hallway outside the parlor. He had come in from the ranch and was heading upstairs to wash up when he heard the raised voices and stopped to listen. Now, as he stood in the shadows, his hands were clenched into fists and his jaw was tight with anger. Samuel Reeves was a snake. Everyone in Amarillo knew it, and the idea of Beatrice being forced to work in his saloon made Wyatt see red. $300. He had about 50 saved up from his extra work, which was nowhere near enough. But he had other resources, things he had been holding onto for a rainy day. His father's gold pocket watch, which was worth at least $20. His saddle, which was custom-made and worth another $50 if he could find the right buyer. His horse, which he loved but would sell in a heartbeat if it meant helping Beatrice. And if that was not enough, he could take out a loan, could indenture himself to the ranch for a few years in exchange for an advance on his wages. But first, he needed to talk to her. Needed to tell her about the dresses and why he had given them to her, and that he was not going to let Samuel Reeves destroy her life. The problem was finding the courage to do it, and the right words to say. Wyatt had never been good with words, had always been more comfortable with horses and cattle than people, and the thought of laying his feelings bare to Beatrice terrified him more than anything he had ever done. He waited until after dinner, until the other boarders had retired to their rooms or gone out for the evening, and then he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and his hands were sweating despite the heat. He stopped in front of Beatrice's door and knocked softly. There was a long pause, and then he heard her voice, small and uncertain. "Who is it?" "Wyatt Morgan," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "I need to talk to you, Miss Nolan. It is important." Another pause, and then the door opened a crack. Beatrice peered out at him, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, still wearing the rose-colored dress. She looked so lost, so vulnerable, that Wyatt had to fight the urge to pull her into his arms right then and there. "What do you want, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, her voice guarded. "Can I come in?" he asked. "I promise I will leave the door open. I just need to talk to you where no one else can hear." She hesitated, and he could see the debate playing out on her face. It was not proper for a man to be in a woman's room, even with the door open, but these were desperate times. Finally, she stepped back and let him in, leaving the door ajar as he had promised. The room looked even smaller with him standing in it, his broad shoulders and tall frame making the tiny space feel claustrophobic. Beatrice backed up until she was standing by the window, her arms wrapped around herself protectively. "What do you want to talk about?" she asked. Wyatt took off his hat and held it in his hands, turning it nervously. "I heard what happened downstairs, with Samuel Reeves." She flinched at the name. "That is none of your concern, Mr. Morgan." "I am making it my concern," he said quietly, "and I want to help. Help." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Unless you have $300 lying around, I do not think there is anything you can do." "I do not have $300, he admitted, "but I can get it. It might take a week or two, but I can get it." Beatrice stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "What are you talking about? Why would you do that?" "Because I care about you," Wyatt said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Because I have been watching you for weeks and seeing how hard you work, how much you sacrifice, how much dignity you hold on to even when life keeps trying to strip it away. And because I was the one who left those dresses on your chair." She went very still, her face pale in the lamplight. "You left the dresses," he nodded. "I saw you wearing that torn dress every day and it just ate at me. You deserved better. So I worked extra shifts at the ranch and saved up enough to buy them. I did not tell you because I did not want you to feel obligated or embarrassed. I just wanted to do something nice for you without expecting anything in return." Beatrice felt tears well up in her eyes again, but this time they were different. Not tears of despair, but tears of something she could not quite name. "Why?" she whispered. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," Wyatt said. "I know that you are kind to people even when they are not kind to you. I know that you hold your head high even when the world is trying to beat you down. I know that you deserve better than Samuel Reeves and his dirty money and his threats. And I know that I cannot stand by and let him hurt you." She was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. "I cannot let you give me $300, Mr. Morgan. That is too much. It would take you years to earn that back." "So I will take years to earn it back," he said simply. "What do I need money for anyway? I do not have a family to support, do not have any plans to buy land or start a business. I would rather spend it helping you than let it sit in a bank somewhere." "But why?" she asked again, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this for me?" Wyatt took a step closer, his gray eyes intense. "Because I think I am falling in love with you, Beatrice Nolan. And I know that is crazy because we have barely spoken a dozen words to each other, and I have no right to feel this way, but there it is. I care about you. I want to help you. And I am not going to let Samuel Reeves or anyone else hurt you if I can prevent it." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Beatrice stared at him, her heart racing, her mind spinning. A man she barely knew was standing in her room telling her he was falling in love with her, offering to save her from a debt that was not his responsibility. It should have felt wrong, should have felt manipulative or threatening, but it did not. When she looked into Wyatt's eyes, all she saw was sincerity and kindness and a vulnerability that matched her own. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "You do not have to say anything," Wyatt replied. "Just let me help you. Let me talk to Reeves and work out a payment plan or something. You do not have to feel anything for me in return. I am not asking for that. I am just asking you to let me do this one thing." Beatrice wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing tears across her cheeks. "You are the kindest man I have ever met, Wyatt Morgan. And I do not deserve your help or your feelings, but I am grateful for both." "You deserve everything good in this world," Wyatt said fiercely. "Do not ever think otherwise." They stood there for a long moment, looking at each other across the small space of the room, and something shifted between them. Some invisible barrier fell away, and Beatrice felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by the warmth in his eyes and the strength in his stance. She thought about all the times she had seen him in the dining room, thought about the quiet way he moved and spoke, the way he always treated her with respect when so many others did not. And she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had been noticing him too. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "It is too much to take in all at once." Wyatt nodded and stepped back, putting his hat on his head. "Take all the time you need, but know that I meant what I said. I am going to help you whether you want me to or not." He left then, closing the door softly behind him, and Beatrice sank down onto her bed, her legs suddenly unable to hold her up. A cowboy she barely knew was in love with her. A cowboy she barely knew was offering to pay off her debts. A cowboy she barely knew had given her 3 dresses without expecting anything in return. It was too much, too overwhelming, and yet a part of her felt lighter than she had in years. That night, she lay awake long after the boarding house had gone quiet, thinking about Wyatt Morgan and his gray eyes and his rough hands and his gentle voice. She thought about the way he had stood in her room, his hat in his hands, offering her salvation without asking for anything in return. She thought about the dresses hanging on their pegs, each one a silent testament to his care and attention. And she thought about the way her heart had sped up when he said he was falling in love with her, the way something inside her had responded to those words like a flower turning toward the sun. The next morning, Beatrice came downstairs wearing the brown dress with the autumn leaves and found Wyatt waiting in the dining room. He stood when she entered, his eyes searching her face, and she gave him a small smile that made his heart leap in his chest. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. "After breakfast," he nodded, not trusting his voice, and sat back down. The meal passed in a blur of serving and clearing, and Beatrice was barely aware of what she was doing. Her mind was on the conversation to come, on the decision she had made in the early hours of the morning when sleep finally eluded her, and she had to face the truth. When the last dish was cleared and Mrs. Hartwell had retreated to her parlor, Beatrice led Wyatt out to the back garden where the laundry lines hung empty in the morning sun. They sat on a wooden bench under one of the cottonwood trees, far enough from the house that they could speak privately but close enough that it was still respectable. "I thought about what you said last night," Beatrice began, her hands folded in her lap. "And I want you to know that I am grateful, more grateful than I can possibly express. But I cannot let you pay my debt." Wyatt opened his mouth to argue, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish. I cannot let you pay my debt because it would not be fair to you. $300 is a fortune, and I have no way to pay you back. I would be trading one debt for another, and I refuse to be beholden to anyone else, no matter how kind they are." "You would not be beholden to me," Wyatt said. "I would not expect repayment." "I know that," Beatrice said gently, "but I would expect it of myself. So here is what I propose. I will let you help me, but only if we do it together. You said you have about $50 saved, and I have a few dollars put away as well. We can pool our resources and see if we can negotiate with Reeves for a lower amount or a payment plan. And if that does not work, then we will figure out another solution. Together." Wyatt looked at her, this proud, stubborn woman who would not accept charity even when she desperately needed it, and felt his admiration deepen into something stronger. "Together," he agreed. "I can live with that." She smiled, a real smile this time that lit up her whole face and made her look years younger. "Thank you, Wyatt, for the dresses and the offer and for caring about someone you barely know. It means more to me than you can imagine." "I want to know you," Wyatt said, his voice low and earnest. "If you will let me. I know I came on strong last night, and I do not expect you to feel the same way I do, but I would like the chance to court you properly. To take you to church socials and picnics, and whatever other respectable things men and women do in this town." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm, but she did not look away. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like that very much." And so it began. Over the next few days, Wyatt and Beatrice worked together to figure out a plan. They met with a lawyer named Mr. Phillips, who had a reputation for being honest and fair, and he reviewed the promissory note that Samuel Reeves held. It turned out that the interest Reeves was charging was illegal under Texas law, which meant the debt was actually closer to $220, not $300. It was still a staggering amount, but it was better than before. Armed with this information, Wyatt went to confront Samuel Reeves at his saloon. He went alone, despite Beatrice's protests, because he did not want her anywhere near the man. The saloon was a gaudy place with red velvet curtains and a long mahogany bar that gleamed in the lamplight. Women in low-cut dresses moved through the crowd, serving drinks and laughing at the jokes of men who smelled of whiskey and sweat. Reeves was in his office in the back, a lavishly appointed room with a desk that probably cost more than Wyatt made in a year. He looked up when Wyatt walked in, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement. "Mr. Morgan," he said, leaning back in his chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I am here about Beatrice Nolan's debt," Wyatt said, his voice hard, "and the illegal interest you are trying to charge." Reeves's smile faltered. "I do not know what you are talking about." "I think you do," Wyatt said. "I had a lawyer look at the promissory note. The interest you are charging is twice what is allowed by law, so the real amount owed is $220, not $300. And I am here to negotiate a payment plan." Reeves's face darkened. "Who are you to come in here making demands?" "I am someone who cares about Miss Nolan and will not let you take advantage of her," Wyatt said. "Now, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is you accept monthly payments until the debt is paid off. The hard way is I take this information to the sheriff and the newspaper and let everyone in Amarillo know that you are a cheat who preys on vulnerable women." It was a bluff, and they both knew it. The sheriff was indeed a friend of Reeves, and the newspaper was not likely to print a story that would anger one of the town's most prominent businessmen. But Reeves also knew that word of mouth traveled fast in a small town, and if people started talking about his illegal interest rates, it could hurt his business. "How much can she pay per month?" Reeves asked after a long silence. $3, Wyatt said, which was a stretch but doable if Beatrice took on extra work and he continued with his double shifts. Reeves did some mental calculations. "At that rate, it will take her over 6 years to pay off the debt." "Then it takes 6 years, Wyatt said. "But you will get your money, and you will not have the reputation of being a man who forces young women into prostitution." Reeves flinched at the word, and Wyatt felt a surge of satisfaction. The man was a snake, but he still had some sense of public image. "Fine," Reeves said finally. $3 a month. But if she misses even one payment, the full amount becomes due immediately and I will take her to court. "Are we clear, Crystal?" Wyatt said. He pulled out a piece of paper he had prepared with Mr. Phillips's help, outlining the terms of the agreement. "Sign this." Reeves read through it, his mouth tight with displeasure, but he signed it and pushed it back across the desk. Wyatt folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, then turned and walked out without another word. When he told Beatrice what had happened, she threw her arms around him in a spontaneous gesture of gratitude and relief. Wyatt froze for a moment, surprised by the contact, and then slowly wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. She smelled of soap and cotton, and something sweet that might have been the lavender water she used to rinse her hair. He felt her trembling against him and tightened his hold, wishing he could protect her from every bad thing in the world. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. We are in this together," he reminded her, echoing her words from before. "You and me." She pulled back and looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You and me," she repeated. And then, before she could think better of it, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was a brief, chaste kiss, just a press of her lips against his, but it sent electricity shooting through Wyatt's entire body. He stood there, stunned and speechless, as she pulled away, her cheeks flushed. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "That was forward of me." "Do not apologize," Wyatt said, his voice rough. "Ever." They stood there in the dusty alley behind the boarding house, looking at each other with new awareness, and both of them knew that something had fundamentally shifted between them. This was no longer just about debts and dresses and acts of kindness. This was about two people finding each other in the midst of hardship and discovering that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real and lasting. Over the next few weeks, Wyatt courted Beatrice with a single-minded determination that made the other boarders smile and Mrs. Hartwell shake her head in amused resignation. He brought her wildflowers from the ranch, the kind that grew along the creek and smelled of summer sunshine. He walked her to church on Sundays and sat beside her in the pew, his rough hand warm around hers. He helped her with the heavy work around the boarding house when Mrs. Hartwell was not looking, hauling water and carrying laundry baskets and fixing the broken step on the back porch. Beatrice bloomed under his attention like a plant that had been deprived of water and was finally getting rain. The sadness that had lived in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a brightness that made her beautiful. She laughed more, smiled more, and the other boarders commented on the change in her demeanor. Even Mrs. Hartwell, who had always been somewhat stern with Beatrice, softened toward her, giving her Sunday afternoons off so she could spend time with Wyatt. They took long walks through Amarillo, exploring the streets and talking about everything and nothing. Wyatt told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about how his parents had died in a tornado when he was 16, leaving him and his younger sister alone. He told her how he had sent his sister to live with their aunt in Kansas City, and then headed west, looking for work and a new start. He told her about the Triple Creek Ranch and the men he worked with, about the long days in the saddle and the quiet beauty of the Texas prairie. Beatrice told him about her childhood, about her mother's gentle hands and her father's booming laugh before the gambling took hold. She told him about the slow decline, the creditors knocking on their door, the day her mother died and her father started drinking in earnest. She told him about the loneliness of the last few years, the feeling of being invisible in a town full of people who knew her story but did not care about her as a person. "You are not invisible to me," Wyatt said, taking her hand as they walked along the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. "You are the most real thing in my life right now." She squeezed his hand, her heart full of emotions she was only beginning to understand. She was falling in love with him, she realized. Not just grateful for his help or appreciative of his kindness, but actually, truly falling in love with the man himself. With his quiet strength and his gentle heart, and the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Summer gave way to fall, and the heat that had pressed down on Amarillo like a blanket began to ease. The cottonwood trees turned gold, and the prairie grass dried to the color of wheat. Beatrice continued to work at the boarding house, but now she had something to look forward to at the end of each day. Wyatt had moved back to the ranch to save money, but he rode into town at least 3 times a week to see her, and they wrote letters to each other in between visits. The debt to Samuel Reeves was being paid down slowly but steadily. Between Beatrice's wages and Wyatt's contributions, they managed to scrape together $3 a month, sometimes a little more when Wyatt took on extra work. It was hard, and there were times when Beatrice wanted to give up, wanted to just run away and start over somewhere else where no one knew her name or her father's sins. But Wyatt was always there, steady and patient, reminding her that they were in this together. In October, Wyatt asked Beatrice to marry him. They were sitting on the bench in the back garden of the boarding house, watching the sun set over the prairie, when he pulled a small ring from his pocket. It was not fancy, just a simple band of gold with a tiny chip of turquoise, but it had belonged to his mother and was the most valuable thing he owned. "I know we have not known each other long," he said, his voice nervous. "And I know we still have a lot of debt to pay off. But I love you, Beatrice Nolan, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Will you marry me?" Beatrice looked at the ring, then at his face, and felt tears stream down her cheeks for the 100th time since she had met this man. But these were happy tears, joyful tears, tears of a future she had never dared to hope for. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you, Wyatt Morgan." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly for the first time, a kiss that was deep and sweet and full of promise. Beatrice melted into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church at the edge of town, with Mrs. Hartwell and Mr. Phillips as witnesses. Beatrice wore the rose-colored dress that Wyatt had given her, and she had never felt more beautiful. Wyatt wore his Sunday best, a clean shirt and dark trousers, and he could not stop staring at his bride as if he still could not believe she was real. The preacher, an elderly man named Reverend Thompson who had known Beatrice since she was a child, smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride," he said, and Wyatt did, right there in front of God and the few people in attendance, a kiss that made Beatrice's toes curl in her worn boots. They could not afford a honeymoon or even a wedding trip, but Wyatt had saved enough to rent a small house on the edge of Amarillo, a 2-room structure with a leaky roof and a stove that only worked half the time. To Beatrice, it was a palace. It was theirs, a place where they could build a life together, and that was all that mattered. Mrs. Hartwell was sorry to lose her best worker, but she gave Beatrice her blessing and even threw a small party at the boarding house to celebrate. The other boarders brought gifts, small things like a set of dish towels and a cast iron skillet, but each one was precious. Mr. Patterson gave them a set of curtains that his wife had made before she passed away. The Sullivan brothers brought a bushel of apples from a tree on their family's property. Even Mr. Chen, who rarely spoke, gave them a beautiful teapot painted with delicate flowers. Beatrice was overwhelmed by the kindness, by the realization that she had been so focused on her own struggles that she had not seen the community around her, the people who had been quietly rooting for her all along. She thanked each person individually, her voice thick with emotion, and Wyatt stood beside her with his arm around her waist, proud and protective. That night, in their small house with its leaky roof and temperamental stove, Beatrice and Wyatt consummated their marriage. It was awkward and a little painful at first, as it often is for young brides, but Wyatt was patient and gentle, taking his time to make sure she was comfortable. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Beatrice felt a sense of completeness she had never experienced before. This was where she belonged, in Wyatt's arms in this tiny house, building a life one day at a time. The months that followed were not easy. They continued to pay down Beatrice's debt, and money was always tight. There were times when they ate nothing but beans and cornbread for a week straight, times when Beatrice had to mend her dresses yet again, because they could not afford new fabric, times when Wyatt came home so exhausted from working double shifts that he could barely keep his eyes open. But there were also moments of profound joy. Sunday mornings when they would lie in bed a little longer than they should, wrapped in each other's arms and talking about their dreams. Evenings when Wyatt would come home with a surprise, a sack of penny candy or a ribbon for Beatrice's hair, some small thing that showed he was thinking of her. Nights when they would sit on the porch and watch the stars come out, Wyatt's arm around Beatrice's shoulders and her head resting against his chest, both of them content in the simple pleasure of being together. Winter came, and with it a cold snap that left ice on the water buckets and frost on the windows. Wyatt worked tirelessly to keep the house warm, chopping wood and banking the fire, making sure Beatrice never went cold. She, in turn, made their small house as comfortable as she could, sewing new curtains from flour sacks and making rugs from scraps of fabric. She learned to cook on the temperamental stove, producing meals that were simple but nourishing, and Wyatt ate everything she made with genuine appreciation. In January, exactly 1 year after Wyatt had first walked into Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, Beatrice realized she was pregnant. She had suspected it for a few weeks, had noticed the changes in her body, and the way her monthly courses had stopped, but she had been afraid to hope. When she finally told Wyatt, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, and then set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You and me, a baby." Beatrice laughed through her tears. "Yes, a baby." "Are you happy?" "Happy." Wyatt pulled her close, his hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "I am the luckiest man alive, Beatrice Morgan. I have you, and now we are going to have a child. I could not ask for anything more." The pregnancy was not easy. Beatrice suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and the smell of cooking food made her so nauseous that Wyatt often had to prepare his own meals. But she pushed through, determined to keep working and contributing to the household. She took in laundry and sewing, working from home so she could rest when she needed to, and Wyatt continued his double shifts at the ranch. By spring, they had managed to pay off more than half of the debt to Samuel Reeves. It was a milestone worth celebrating, and Wyatt took Beatrice to the one nice restaurant in Amarillo, a place called the Golden Spur that served steaks and potatoes and had real linen napkins. It was an extravagance they could not really afford, but Wyatt wanted to mark the occasion, wanted Beatrice to feel special and celebrated. As they ate, Beatrice looked across the table at her husband, this man who had changed her life so completely, and felt her heart swell with love. He had kept his promise. He had stood by her through everything, had never once complained about the sacrifices he was making, had loved her with a steadiness and devotion that took her breath away. "What are you thinking about?" Wyatt asked, noticing the expression on her face. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Beatrice said. "How different my life would be if you had not walked into that boarding house." Wyatt reached across the table and took her hand. "I am the lucky one. You gave me a reason to stay in Amarillo, a reason to work hard and build something. Before I met you, I was just drifting, going from job to job without any real purpose. You gave me purpose, Beatrice. You gave me a home." They finished their meal and walked back to their little house hand in hand, watching the stars come out over the prairie. Beatrice's stomach was just starting to show the swell of the baby, and Wyatt kept glancing down at it, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In August, as the summer heat returned with a vengeance, Beatrice went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth that lasted nearly 24 hours, and there were moments when Wyatt thought he would lose his mind from worry and helplessness. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. O'Brien, shooed him out of the room more than once, telling him he was getting in the way, but he could not stay away. He paced outside the door, praying harder than he had ever prayed in his life, begging God to keep Beatrice safe. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, he heard a baby's cry. Mrs. O'Brien opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Morgan, a healthy, strong boy, and your wife is fine. Exhausted, but fine." Wyatt rushed into the room and found Beatrice propped up against the pillows, her face pale and damp with sweat but glowing with happiness. In her arms was a tiny red-faced infant wrapped in a blanket, his son. Their son. "He is perfect," Beatrice whispered as Wyatt knelt beside the bed. "Look at him, Wyatt. He has your eyes." Wyatt looked down at the baby, at the tiny fingers and the downy hair and the miniature features, and felt something break open in his chest. Love, fierce and overwhelming, flooded through him. "What should we name him?" he asked. "I was thinking James," Beatrice said. "After your father." Wyatt blinked back tears. His father had died when he was 16, but he still remembered the man's strength and kindness, the way he had worked hard to provide for his family. "James Morgan," he said, testing the name. "I like that." They spent the next few days in a haze of new parenthood, learning to navigate the needs of a newborn. James was a hungry baby who woke every few hours to nurse, and Beatrice was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced. But Wyatt was there for every moment, changing diapers and walking the floor with the baby when he was fussy, taking on even more of the household chores so Beatrice could rest. The people of Amarillo rallied around them in ways that surprised and touched them both. Mrs. Hartwell brought over a basket of food and insisted on doing their laundry for a week. Mr. Phillips's wife, whom they had never even met, sent over a box of baby clothes that her own children had outgrown. Even the Sullivan brothers, rough men who Wyatt would have thought had no interest in babies, showed up with a handmade cradle that they had built in their spare time. "Figured the little guy needed a proper place to sleep," one of them said gruffly, setting the cradle down in the corner of the room. It was a beautiful piece of work, smooth and sturdy, with carved animals running along the headboard. Beatrice cried, which seemed to be her default state these days, and thanked them profusely. Wyatt shook their hands, his own throat tight with emotion. He had spent so much of his life alone, drifting from place to place, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be part of a community, to have people who cared about you and your family. As summer turned to fall and James grew from a tiny newborn to a plump, smiling baby, life settled into a new rhythm. Beatrice continued to take in sewing and laundry, working while the baby napped, and Wyatt continued his work at the Triple Creek Ranch. The debt to Samuel Reeves continued to shrink, and they allowed themselves to hope that within another year or two, it would be paid off completely. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Beatrice turned to Wyatt with a serious expression. "I have been thinking about something," she said. "What is that?" Wyatt asked, bouncing James on his knee. The baby gurgled happily, reaching for his father's face. "I want to write to your sister," Beatrice said. "I know you have not seen her in years, and I think it is time to reconnect. James should know his aunt, and she should know that her brother is married and has a family." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his expression conflicted. "I do not even know if she would want to hear from me. I left her with our aunt and just sent money when I could. I was not much of a brother." "You were 16 years old and doing the best you could," Beatrice said firmly. "You made sure she was taken care of, and that is what matters. But she is an adult now, and she deserves to know about her nephew." Wyatt looked down at James, at the baby's chubby face and bright eyes, and felt his resistance crumble. "You are right," he said. "I will write to her." It took him several evenings to compose the letter, carefully explaining where he was and what had happened in his life since he last saw his sister. He told her about Beatrice, about the debt and the dresses and the way they had fallen in love. He told her about James and how much he wished she could meet him. And he apologized for not staying in better contact, for letting the years slip away without making more of an effort. The letter went out in early November, and they waited anxiously for a response. It came 6 weeks later, just before Christmas, and Wyatt's hands were shaking as he opened it. His sister, whose name was Sarah, had written back with warmth and forgiveness, saying she understood why he had done what he did, and that she was thrilled to hear about his family. She was living in Kansas City, working as a schoolteacher, and she hoped that someday they could visit each other. Wyatt read the letter out loud to Beatrice, his voice catching on certain phrases, and when he finished, she wrapped her arms around him and held him close. "You see," she said, "you have a family now. Not just me and James, but Sarah too. We are building something here, Wyatt, something good and lasting." He nodded against her hair, too overwhelmed to speak. She was right. Against all odds, despite the hardships and the struggles and the debts that still hung over them, they were building a life. A real life, with love and hope and a future that stretched out before them, full of possibility. Christmas that year was simple but joyful. They could not afford many gifts, but Beatrice made Wyatt a new shirt from fabric she had carefully saved for, and Wyatt bought Beatrice a book of poetry that he had seen her admiring in the window of the general store. For James, who was too young to know what was happening, they gave him a wooden rattle that Wyatt had carved himself during the long winter evenings. They attended the Christmas service at church, and as they sat in the pew with James sleeping in Beatrice's arms, Wyatt looked around at the other families and felt a sense of belonging he had not experienced in years. This was home, not the building or the town, but the people. Beatrice and James and the community that had embraced them despite their struggles. As the new year of 1885 began, they received good news. The foreman at the Triple Creek Ranch, Old Pete, was retiring, and he recommended Wyatt for the position. It came with a substantial raise and a house on the ranch property that was much larger and in better condition than the one they were currently renting. Wyatt accepted immediately, and within a month, they had moved their few belongings out to the ranch. The house was a revelation. It had 3 rooms instead of 2 glass windows that did not have cracks in them, and a stove that actually worked properly. There was a small barn for Wyatt's horse and a chicken coop that Beatrice immediately claimed, excited at the prospect of having fresh eggs. The land stretched out around them in all directions, endless prairie that turned gold in the afternoon sun, and Beatrice felt like she could breathe for the first time in years. With Wyatt's increased salary, they were able to pay off the remaining debt to Samuel Reeves by the end of February. Wyatt made the final payment in person, walking into the saloon with his head held high and handing over the money. Reeves counted it carefully, his expression sour, and then signed a receipt marking the debt as paid in full. "I suppose you think you are quite the hero," Reeves said as Wyatt folded the receipt and put it in his pocket. "I think I am a man who keeps his promises," Wyatt said evenly. "And I think you are a man who preys on people who cannot defend themselves. But we are done now, and I hope I never have to see you again." He walked out without waiting for a response, and as he rode back to the ranch, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it was there. They were free. The debt was paid, and they could finally start building their lives without that shadow hanging over them. When he told Beatrice, she burst into tears, which made James start crying too, and then they were all laughing and crying together in the kitchen of their new house. Wyatt picked up his wife and son and spun them around, whooping with joy, and Beatrice held on tight, her heart so full she thought it might burst. That spring, Wyatt planted a garden for Beatrice, turning over the hard, packed earth and creating neat rows where she could grow vegetables and herbs. She threw herself into the work with enthusiasm, planting seeds and watering them carefully, watching with delight as the first green shoots appeared. She had chickens now, too, a half-dozen hens that provided eggs and the occasional meat for the table, and she felt like a real homesteader, building something from nothing. James grew into a rambunctious toddler, learning to walk and then run, getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of the young. Wyatt loved coming home from work to find his son racing across the yard to greet him, chubby arms outstretched, shouting "Papa, Papa" at the top of his lungs. Those moments made every hardship, every sacrifice worth it. In the summer of 1885, Sarah came to visit. She arrived on the train from Kansas City, a pretty young woman of 22 with her brother's gray eyes and a warm smile. Beatrice liked her immediately, and Sarah was equally taken with her new sister-in-law and nephew. She stayed for 2 weeks, and during that time, the house was full of laughter and conversation, and the kind of easy affection that comes from family. On the last evening of her visit, they sat on the porch watching the sun set, and Sarah took Wyatt's hand. "I am so proud of you," she said. "Look at what you have built here. A family, a home, a life. You did good, big brother." Wyatt looked at Beatrice, who was bouncing James on her knee and singing him a lullaby, and then back at his sister. "I got lucky," he said. "I found someone worth building a life for." Sarah smiled. "I do not think luck had much to do with it. I think you saw someone who needed help, and you did not look away. That takes courage and kindness, and those are things you have always had, even when you were a scared 16-year-old kid trying to figure out how to survive." After Sarah left, Beatrice told Wyatt that she was pregnant again. This time there was no fear or uncertainty, only joy and excitement. They knew what to expect now, knew that they could handle whatever came their way. The pregnancy was easier than the first, and in February of 1886, Beatrice gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after the color of the dress Wyatt had given her all those years ago. Rose was a tiny, delicate baby with dark hair and her mother's hazel eyes, and Wyatt fell in love with her the moment he held her. James, now 2.5, was fascinated by his new sister, wanting to touch her constantly and help with everything. Beatrice spent her days in a happy chaos of caring for 2 small children, and while it was exhausting, she would not have traded it for anything. The years passed in a blur of work and love, and the million small moments that make up a life. James started school in Amarillo, riding into town with his father in the morning and coming home full of stories about his day. Rose grew into a sweet, quiet child who loved flowers and animals and spent hours in the garden with her mother. Beatrice and Wyatt's relationship deepened and matured, the passionate early days of their courtship giving way to a steadier, more enduring love that was built on mutual respect and shared experiences. Wyatt continued to work at the Triple Creek Ranch, earning the respect of the other cowboys and the trust of the ranch owner, a wealthy cattleman named Mr. Jacobson, who appreciated his foreman's work ethic and integrity. Beatrice became known in Amarillo for her sewing skills, and she often took on commissions for wedding dresses and Sunday best, earning money that she carefully saved for the children's future. In 1890, when James was 7 and Rose was 4, they received a letter from Sarah saying that she was getting married to a man named Thomas who worked as an accountant in Kansas City. She invited them to the wedding, and after much discussion and saving, they decided to make the trip. It was the first time any of them had left Texas, and the train ride was an adventure that the children talked about for months afterward. The wedding was a joyful affair, and Beatrice was thrilled to see Sarah so happy. Thomas was a kind, steady man who clearly adored his bride, and watching them exchange vows, Beatrice thought about her own wedding day nearly 8 years earlier. She had worn the rose-colored dress and married a man who had given her 3 dresses without saying anything, a man who had seen her when she was invisible to everyone else. And that simple act of kindness had changed the course of her entire life. On the train ride home, with the children asleep in their seats and the Texas prairie rolling by outside the window, Beatrice leaned her head on Wyatt's shoulder and took his hand. "You remember the day you left those dresses on my chair?" she asked. "I remember," Wyatt said, smiling at the memory. "I was so nervous I thought you might be angry or insulted." "I was confused," Beatrice admitted, "and then overwhelmed, and then grateful, but I never imagined that it would lead to all of this. To us, to our children, to the life we have built together." Wyatt kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made, spending all that money on 3 dresses for a girl I barely knew." "They were the best dresses I ever owned," Beatrice said. "I still have them, you know. Folded away in the trunk in our bedroom, I could not bear to get rid of them." "Why would you?" Wyatt asked. "They are part of our story, the beginning of everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rhythm of the train on the tracks, and Beatrice thought about how far they had come. From the desperate poverty of her life at the boarding house to this moment, traveling home to their ranch with their 2 beautiful children and a future full of promise. It seemed impossible, like a dream that could not possibly be real, but it was real, every bit of it. The hardships and the joys, the struggles and the triumphs, the ordinary days and the extraordinary moments. It was all real, and it was all theirs. As the years continued to unfold, Wyatt and Beatrice watched their children grow. James became a serious, studious boy who loved books and learning, talking about becoming a lawyer or a teacher someday. Rose was more like her father, preferring to be outside working with the animals, and by the time she was 8, she could ride a horse as well as any of the ranch hands. They had another child in 1893, a son they named Daniel, who had his mother's curly hair and his father's quiet determination. The ranch prospered under Wyatt's management, and Mr. Jacobson came to rely on him more and more as the years went by. When the owner's health began to fail in 1896, he made Wyatt a partner in the operation, recognizing that the ranch's success was due in large part to the foreman's skill and dedication. It was a development that changed everything for the Morgan family, providing them with financial security they had never dreamed possible. But despite their increased prosperity, Wyatt and Beatrice never forgot where they came from. They gave generously to those in need, supported the church and the school in Amarillo, and made sure their children understood the value of hard work and compassion. The 3 dresses still hung in the trunk in their bedroom, a reminder of the kindness that had started it all, and sometimes Beatrice would take them out and hold them, remembering the girl she had been, and the man who had seen past the torn dress to the person underneath. On a warm evening in the spring of 1898, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set over the prairie, Beatrice turned to Wyatt with tears in her eyes. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not left those dresses for me?" she asked. Wyatt pulled her close, his arm around her shoulders. "I try not to. The thought of you going to work for Samuel Reeves or ending up in debtor's prison or just disappearing from my life before I really knew you makes me sick." "I think I would have survived somehow," Beatrice said thoughtfully. "Women do. We find a way. But I would not have had this. I would not have had you and our children and this beautiful life we have built together. And I cannot imagine anything worse than living in a world where I never got to love you." Wyatt turned her face toward his and kissed her, a long, sweet kiss that held 15 years of love and partnership and shared history. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "I love you, Beatrice Morgan," Wyatt said. "From the first moment I saw you hanging laundry in that torn dress, I loved you, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Beatrice said. "My cowboy, my hero, my heart." They sat together as the stars came out one by one, filling the vast Texas sky with light. Inside the house, They could hear the sounds of their children getting ready for bed, the normal, ordinary sounds of a family going about their evening routine. It was a good life, a blessed life, and they had earned every moment of it through hard work and sacrifice and an unshakable commitment to each other. The years continued to pass, bringing joys and sorrows as they always do. James went off to university in Austin, becoming a lawyer as he had always dreamed. Rose married a rancher from a neighboring spread and started her own family. Daniel took over more and more of the ranch operations as Wyatt got older, proving to be as capable and dedicated as his father. Sarah and Thomas had 4 children of their own and made regular visits from Kansas City, filling the house with laughter and chaos. Wyatt and Beatrice grew old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down, but their love never diminished. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other goodnight, still looked at each other with the same warmth and affection they had felt in those early days of their courtship. They became grandparents and then great-grandparents, watching their family tree branch out in ways they had never imagined when they were young and struggling to make ends meet. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, their children threw them a party at the ranch. It seemed like half of Amarillo showed up, along with friends and family from as far away as Kansas City and Austin. There was music and dancing and more food than they could eat. And as Wyatt and Beatrice stood in the middle of the crowd, surrounded by the people they loved, they felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Later that evening, when the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Beatrice pulled out the trunk from their bedroom and carefully lifted out the 3 dresses. They were old now, the colors faded and the fabric worn in places, but they were still beautiful. She held them up one by one, remembering the green dress with the white flowers that she had worn on that first morning after finding them, feeling pretty for the first time in years. The brown dress with the autumn leaves that she had worn on the day Wyatt proposed, her heart so full she thought it would burst. And the rose-colored dress that she had worn to their wedding, standing before God and the community and promising to love Wyatt Morgan for the rest of her life. "You kept them all these years," Wyatt said from the doorway, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course I did," Beatrice said. "They are the most important dresses I will ever own. They represent the moment when someone saw me, really saw me, and cared enough to do something about it. They represent the beginning of us." Wyatt crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head. "I saw a beautiful, strong, courageous woman who deserved better than what life had given her. And I wanted to give her something better, even if it was just 3 dresses. You gave me everything," Beatrice said, turning in his arms to face him. "A home, a family, a life worth living. You gave me yourself, Wyatt, and that was the greatest gift of all." They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, the 3 dresses spread out on the bed beside them. 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together through hard work and sacrifice, and an unshakable belief in each other. 2 people who had loved and been loved, who had raised children and grandchildren, who had weathered storms and celebrated triumphs. 2 people who had started with 3 dresses left on a chair without a word and ended up with a love story that would be told for generations to come. As they prepared for bed that night, Beatrice carefully folded the dresses and put them back in the trunk. She knew that someday, when she was gone, her daughters and granddaughters would find them and wonder about their history. And she hoped that someone would tell them the story, would explain how a simple act of kindness from a cowboy had changed the course of one woman's life and created a legacy of love that would endure long after they were both gone. Wyatt and Beatrice lived many more years together, surrounded by the love of their family and the respect of their community. When Beatrice finally passed away in 1931 at the age of 68, she died peacefully in her sleep with Wyatt holding her hand. He followed her just 6 months later, unable to bear the thought of a world without her in it. They were buried side by side in the cemetery in Amarillo, under a headstone that read, "Together Forever." And in the house on the Triple Creek Ranch, in a trunk in what had been their bedroom, 3 dresses remained. Faded and worn, but still beautiful, still precious, still a testament to the power of kindness and the transformative nature of love. The green dress with the white flowers. The brown dress with the autumn leaves. The rose-colored dress that had been worn to a wedding that changed everything. 3 dresses left on a chair without saying anything. 3 dresses that became the foundation of a love story that spanned decades and generations. 3 dresses that reminded everyone who heard the story that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the most profound impact. And that love, real love, starts with seeing someone not for what they lack, but for who they truly are. The Morgan family continued to thrive long after Wyatt and Beatrice were gone, their descendants spreading across Texas and beyond, carrying with them the values and the love that had been instilled by the cowboy and the woman in the torn dress. And whenever someone asked about the 3 faded dresses in the old trunk, there was always someone ready to tell the story, to explain how it all began with a simple act of kindness and grew into something beautiful and lasting and true. In the end, that was their legacy. Not just the ranch or the family or the material things they had accumulated over the years, but the love. The fierce, enduring, unconditional love that had started the day Wyatt Morgan saw Beatrice Nolan and decided to do something about it. The love that had carried them through poverty and debt, through hardship and struggle, through the ordinary days and the extraordinary moments that make up a life. The love that began with 3 dresses and lasted forever.